It's recording. So welcome everybody to Care and the Future of Learning series. This is episode 3 with Astrid, Lorange and Andrew Brooks. I'd like to welcome you, and we'll talk a bit more about your paper, Endless Study and Infinite Debt, shortly. But for people who don't know you, in terms of the audience, would you like to just share a few thoughts about, what you do, who you are, and so on and so forth? Anyone can start.
I'll start. Hi, my name's Astrid Lorange. I'm a senior lecturer in art theory in the School of Art and Design at UNSW in Sydney. I'm a cultural studies scholar, and I mainly look at contemporary poetry, art and media. I'm working at the moment on documentary practices in contemporary poetry and art that remediate materials of statecraft, and I'm also interested in sort of social and collective readings of lyric poetry and contemporary art practice.
Great. Andrew.
My name's Andrew Brooks. Very lovely to be here with you. I am a lecturer in the School of Arts and Media at UNSW as well. And my work looks at a number of interrelated things. It looks at social movements and responses to crisis. From a kind of historical materialist perspective. It looks at the relationship between infrastructure and inequality, as a lot of Astrid's work does, and that's some work we do together. And also looks at, I suppose, the kind of politics of race and embodiment in media culture. So that's a little bit about me. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the paper and I guess the context of it and what inspired you in terms of writing it and so on and so forth.
Well, I'll say in the very first instance, it came from a lovely invitation from you, Mary, to contribute to this special issue on care in the classroom in the context of COVID, and thinking about the kind of sudden shift of teaching and learning from kind of face-to-face context into the online context that COVID ushered in. And so that was the initial impetus for thinking about this. Astrid, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I also think it was, we both teach and we collaborate together and we do a lot of scholarly work together. So it was an opportunity for us to think reflexively about our own pedagogy in the context of COVID, but also I guess it's important to say that we also make art together as the Critical Art Collective Snack Syndicate, and a lot of our work deals with crisis and the politics of institutions and with labour and with study. And so I think it also was an interesting invitation for us to consider our teaching inside the classroom and then our practice as artists who often deal with pedagogy and discourse in the space of the social artwork. And that's something that we've never really done in a paper. It's not necessarily something that we would ordinarily do or even necessarily always feel comfortable doing. So it also presented a really rich opportunity to do something a little bit outside our comfort zone and actually take our own artistic practice as an object of analysis in a scholarly paper.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to say about as we started working through these things, obviously, as Astrid has just said, there is a relationship between what we do in our jobs as university teachers and researchers and the work we are doing in the kind of context of exhibition making and the art world, which is in some ways a kind of extension of the concerns we have in our research that finds another form and often tries to find or tries to bring some of that kind of pedagogical spirit to different settings, to the gallery as a setting, tries, a lot of the work we make as a art collective is pedagogical work. It's about the process of collective study, and it's about the conditions of collective study, and it's about how we come together to study in excess sometimes of the sort of institutional things that can constrain study. And so that was a really interesting opportunity for us to think about and to think a little more formally about the relationship between these two things, which were both radically rearranged by COVID. The capacity to inhabit the classroom and the capacity to do things in the gallery were temporarily foreclosed. As we got into thinking about this, we also wanted to think about it in the context of a kind of ongoing culture war that has seen systemic cuts and austerity in both the higher ed sector and the art sector in ways that long precede the COVID crisis. And so we wanted to also think about the sort of longer history of the erosion for public funding and public support for these types of activities, and how how as teachers and artists we can do things that are conscious of those austerity conditions and able to kind of maybe draw resources from both institutional sites that we're in order to kind of make a kind of pedagogical engagement that exceeds both, or that sits somewhere in between those two institutions.
And there's something, if I could ask you both in that context, because the paper really does bring together in interesting ways that kind of problematic or even the kind of ethical questions of sitting in that space. And because also the confrontation, in a way, in terms of confrontation in a positive way, was also about this idea of care. And I'm just wondering where it sits in that nexus for you, because care is a problematic term sometimes. It can be used in particular ways, but there is something about the practice that you're engaged with, whether you would name it as such or not, but is about this concern with trying to enable, I guess, different ways of thinking about teaching, I suppose. Astrid,
Yeah.
maybe I'll go to Astrid first, maybe.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really interesting term, and one that, as you say, invites a lot of kind of provocation around it. And I think for us, one thing that was really important was to disambiguate care and not to begin our study with a presumption that care is a given good, or even that we understand the terms in which care is given as an analytic. So to think in our own job about some of the competing notions of care at play. There is the kind of care handed down to us from the university itself, this kind of notion of pastoral care, which is often quite constrained by the university operating, as it does. This kind of care that we are asked to give our students, which often feels impossible given the conditions of teaching and learning that actually kind of constrain our work. And then so there is this kind of other type of care, perhaps like a sort of informal or fugitive care, which we desire to kind of freight across some of the barriers in our job to offer our students. But then there's a certain kind of ethics of trying to understand the limit, or like trying to have limits also on not sort of assuming that our job happens all on our own time, all like, against our own needs to, protect ourselves from burnout. And so there's, I think, a lot of different registers that care is happening in the university, some of which are directly opposed, some of which are paradoxically related, some of which are, naturally kind of complementary. And so we thought, rather than trying to resolve those contradictions, we thought we would just try to sort of map them out, to fully study them, and to think about the different ways that care comes, from above, from below, in lateral relationships, as a genuine ethic of our pedagogy, as well as a certain kind of political modality, which draws on histories of solidarity, histories of coalitional organizing, histories of resistance, which, while they take up care as a genuine and sort of material desire, also do so without sort of imagining that care is without certain types of violence, or without certain types of disagreement, or without certain types of moments of conflict, or moments of
history.
Exactly. So I think that was kind of, Andrew, you can probably jump in and sort of take up that point more clearly, but yeah.
I mean, I think, like, we were trying to think with all of those different meanings of the word care without disavowing them, and to take seriously the ways that we, try to enact that principle, but also some of the limitations of that and some of the things that we might want to push against. And I think that question of violence is a really important one. And I think in thinking about care and writing this paper, we were trying to think about what we learned from studying those kinds of revolutionary movements, and what it means to, say, try to think through race as a structure of domination and racism as a kind of a violent act in the world, and what it means to kind of think about that in the pedagogical setting might involve a certain type of unsettling of the self. It might involve a kind of confrontation with oneself that is in and of itself kind of a type of violence, in order to sort of overcome or dismantle or abolish the kind of the naturalization of race and racism. So, those kinds of things we were trying to move against some of the way that a kind of care discourse has been co-opted into a kind of sometimes slightly wishy-washy self-care rhetoric, and to think in fact maybe sometimes the things, in order to kind of confront and think about the work of dismantling these structures of misery that we live underneath, sometimes that process is full of fracture and full of a certain type of discomfort and tension and antagonism and violence even.
I mean, what's interesting, and I'll just draw us to a close here too, is the art, the collective art practice, I guess, that you're engaged in, how that in a way feeds back into the classroom in different ways. But I think it's having that potential, I think, that enables, something else to happen, because I think if we didn't have that, we would be feeling the real weight of history. But can I ask you if you have any final comments or thoughts that you'd like to make before we round up our time together?
No, I mean, I think we've really covered the spirit of it. I think just one thing that I would add to the periodization we offered, because I think it's kind of one thing that I think I really, really gained from writing this paper, was thinking about the specific and, sudden conditions that COVID has wrought in the larger context that Andrew just articulated of, decades of austerity and defunding of the university and the art sector, and the general kind of, I guess, move towards defunding the social store itself. And I think one thing that we really kind of came to in our articulation of this paper, which I think was valuable, was setting that periodization against the larger kind of political, economic, situation of the long 20th century, if you like. And I think that was really important, I think, in not sort of piling our analysis into this one term neoliberalism that was asked to do everything, and explaining how it is we come to live in a university that looks a particular way and participate in an art world that feels a certain type of way, but actually to kind of keep that periodization open enough to consider the larger forces at play. And that, I think, has been really helpful in being able to bring some nuance to our own interests as teachers and as scholars, but also perhaps also bring a little bit more historical texture to our artworks as well. So that would be the one thing I'd like to end with.
Yeah, and we were really in debt. We should give a shout out to Annie McClanahan's really fantastic essay, Rethinking the Neoliberal Subject, I think is the name of the essay, which offers a very instructive and very precise kind of analysis of the kind of history of the term in order that we might sort of disaggregate it from what it often does, which is to sort of act as a kind of umbrella term under which a lot of things just kind of hide behind in a sort of indiscriminate way. So it was very useful for us to kind of think through the kind of history of that term in order to think about it as a periodizing concept that also maybe we have moved beyond, and we might be moving beyond in order to kind of think about the specificities of, you know, the end of, or the limits of capitalist growth.
Thank you. I was going to thought you were going to say the end of the world, but you know. Anyway, but look, thanks kindly to both of you for being part of this conversation, and thank you for the authorship of the paper too. It was fantastic. It had this really interesting, all of the things you said, but contextualising care, neoliberalism, activism, and rethinking it within the context of kind of pedagogy and your own envisaging of that in your own projects. So it was wonderful.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation to contribute to it, and for the wonderful editorial work. And
yes, thank you.
It's been really wonderful to engage with the rest of the issue as well.
Editorial work is often, you know, like partly invisibilized through its own elegance. So thank you, Mary, for all the work that you did in conceiving it and shepherding it and massaging it and finessing it. Thank you.
Oh, it's enjoyable having these conversations and workshops. I mean, that was part of the whole thing. So thank you.
Thank you.